Hey folks, it's your friend Ashton, and welcome to the Rooted Rebellion podcast, the show that's reshaping the food system from the ground up. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rooted Rebellion podcast. You're here because you care about what goes on your plate and how it impacts the lives of those around you. Thank you for caring, and as always, thank you for joining me. Where does the food system begin and end? The more that I come to learn about our food, the more that I believe that food production done well is an endless cycle with a life all its own. Today, we're going to talk about what many consider the terminal point of the food cycle and others, the very start. We're going to learn more about the power our food holds once it leaves our plate. As you may have guessed, friends, we're talking compost. I'm honored to host Alissa LaChance for today's chat. Friend and founder of Dirt Rich Compost, Alissa empowers clients to take ownership of their food waste as a means for producing new life. Dirt Rich Compost services homes, businesses, and does the vital work of educating the public. Last year, Dirt Rich achieved a pretty mighty feat, annual diversion rate of 1 million pounds of food scraps from the landfill. And I don't think I need to tell you why that's a pretty big deal. Here to discuss her mission, her methods, and the hope that compost delivers is Alissa LaChance. Alissa, hello, and welcome to the Rooted Rebellion podcast. I'm so happy to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashton. I'm glad to be here.
It is an absolute pleasure. Let's get into the thick of it. Today, we are talking all things compost, and particularly, we're going to be talking about your role in your business, Dirt Rich Compost, which I absolutely love the name, by the way. If I haven't mentioned that to you previously, I think that is just genius. To get us started here, why don't you tell us a little bit about Dirt Rich's history? How did this come about?
Sure, yeah. It's not a novel concept. There are community composters like myself that I'm actually a part of a coalition across the country. But at the time, it was kind of a new idea for Montana. And I finished up my undergrad in Missoula and came home and was thinking I would start a farm. And one of my good friends growing up had been setting bins out at the farmer's market for free and just letting people, like vendors, throw some stuff in there, and she would take it back home and compost in her backyard, like 30 gallons or something a week. And she had a concessionaire of Glacier Park's sustainability coordinator approach her. And he was like, "We'd love for you to compost for Xanterra and for, all of Glacier National Park." And she was like, "Cool. I don't think, I don't have the capacity to do that. And, I'm just doing this in my backyard." And she talked to me about it. And I had just gotten home from school and had a bit of a farming background. And I was like, oh my gosh, we absolutely need this for our community. This is a huge opportunity. And I know that, when these bigger companies are on board and they want to help get things going, it's important to respond to that. And she asked if I wanted to hop on board and make it happen. And I was like, absolutely. So that was in 2015 and Dirt Rich was born. And yeah, we had about 4 months to throw together a dump truck and find land and to put everything together, all the infrastructure, the most basic level infrastructure together to start serving the Indigenous concessionaire of Glacier National Park and be hauling food waste for them and processing it and composting it. So it was an interesting experience to get it up and running for sure. And I kind of just fell into it and ended up loving it.
That's a pretty sizable jumping off point to go from composting in your backyard to servicing this huge national park. So what Dirt Rich in its earliest days look like? What was the infrastructure needed?
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago was a very different time in the Flathead Valley. And, we had help from a private funder who helped like invest a little bit in the company and get us going. And we found a piece of property on the edge of Columbia Falls, which is about like 10 or 15 miles from West Glacier, for about $50,000. And I don't know what it's worth now. I haven't even looked. And, you know, a s- I can't even remember, a barely functioning Ford 350, and got a dump bed attached to it, and invested in the tiniest tractor you could get, like a compact tractor, very used compact tractor. And that was what we had. We had no buildings, we had no water, yeah, no utilities at all. But we had the basics of what we needed to haul and, process that material, which was the tractor and the land to do it on.
Sounds like you truly were dirt rich at that point.
Yeah.
So, how has the business advanced since those early days? Where are you at now?
Yeah, we celebrated 10 years last year, which is really wild to me. I've built this company with half of my 20s and now half of my 30s, and I've learned a lot along the way. We started, with just that one big contract, and I had to learn to come up with a pitch and a sell for people to get restaurants and residents on board with composting with me. It's like any recycling service, doorstep recycling service. Like, part of how it functions is we collect a fee from people, and we pick up that material and bring it back to our site, process it, and then sell it as compost on the other end. And in a place where I think it's like the eighth, maybe even the less than that, like the eighth cheapest place in the country to throw things away. Impossible to compete with the prices of the landfill here. So you really have to help people and educate people about why it's important. And that has been a big growing curve for me, and helping to make systems super simple for people to sign up and participate, and convince them that it's not going to be stinky or overwhelming. And we're still in that process. So much of what we do is educational. And, now probably for the last like 5 or 6 years now, people call me and they want to start composting instead of me having to go to them and help them understand why it's important, and ask them to invest in their community and invest in how they manage their waste within the community. Yeah, so things have shifted where people know who we are and they're starting to understand, along with like, things like Kiss the Ground and cultural shifts that are out there with people talking about composting and why it's important. Just the culture around it is shifting, and there's a little more traction that's been gained over the last 10 years. I think we started with, gosh, I don't remember exactly how many gallons we were collecting like the first year, but we just crossed our big goal, like our threshold of over 1 million pounds a year, which was a big deal for us.
It's a huge deal, and that is certainly something to be celebrated. Can you explain some of those cultural shifts that you're talking about? What an important context. What have you seen change in the time of your operation?
Yeah. When I first started, people were really confused about why they would do that, like why they would give someone their food scraps or not just throw them in the trash, and why they had value. And, from 2015 to 2025, it's part of our business being present in the community and people learning about what we do and why we do it. And it's also just the larger cultural understanding in America about soil and organics and recycling in general, just gaining some more traction, and people getting those concepts in a bigger way, and then getting more excited about finding out that a company like ours lives in the area and that they can participate. So it's kind of coming down from the top down and from the down up.
Yeah, that's a change that we're always thrilled to see, and I'm sure your business is as well. Let's take it back just a step for maybe our listeners who haven't composted at all. You keep bringing up how important it is to educate your consumers. What is the importance of composting? Why would someone want to compost rather than letting their food scraps go to the landfill? I think maybe this myth that we have is that, they're going to break down in the landfill anyway. So what's the difference? How do you reconcile that with others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge topic of conversation that touches into like, larger scope of like who we are as humans and what we're doing on this planet. But I don't take it there initially with people. It's important for them to understand, like, a lot of people can understand the concept of efficiency and systems that make sense and systems that don't. So helping like give some basic data and statistics like, yeah, in our agricultural system, we spend anywhere from 7 to 10 calories to produce one of energy, to produce one energy calorie of food. Very inefficient and silly. And then we take all of that food that we produce in that insanely inefficient system and we waste 40% of it. 40% of it doesn't end up being fed to anybody. And then of that material, a huge portion of it just ends up in the landfill. Just people hearing that, it's like helps them to see, how does that make sense? It's just a system that doesn't make sense. And I also like to talk to people about how the way that we manage waste in this country now is so new. Waste in general is like, as modern cultures, is so new. It's probably been about 100 years where people didn't automatically assume that any of the food that wasn't eaten, first of all, you didn't waste food. That was a luxury. For one to waste food was just insanity. And then for food that scraps, anything that wasn't used in broth or sauerkraut or something of the sort, okay, well, you put it back in the soil to grow more food. Like people's great great grandmother will look at what we're doing now and be like shocked and confused and not, perhaps like not fully getting behind our current systems and how we look at things and function.
And what do you think people lose when they fail to take part in composting? It's this vital part of our food system that I think so many neglect to even lump into the food system. And yet it is so important. So, what's being lost there at the most basic level for soil health, and what's being lost in terms of participating in something bigger than ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this with like lots of other people that have been on this podcast, that as a society, we're more disconnected from each other, from the planet, from ourselves than we've ever been. Um, and, these basic tenets of the fact that we are not separate from the earth, like we are made of the earth, we affect the earth, earth affects us, we support the earth supports us. When we are able to reconnect back to those concepts and that like actual visceral understanding and like embodiment in ourselves, like I would venture to say that a lot of our current human misery could be alleviated. You know, I feel like so much of what we struggle with as humans is because we're so dissociated from the basics of how we function as a living being and how we depend on the planet and each other to live. So, getting back to those basic tenets of like understanding how food is connected to soil, how we utilize food and we connect that food that isn't used back to the soil, and just understanding those basic ways of connecting to life. Like, I find it incredibly fulfilling. It was incredibly healing for me to, as a younger person, to be connected to soil, growing food, understanding these concepts of composting and nourishing the soil that nourishes us. Like, it changed my life. And I think it changes a lot of people's lives. And I see the people that work with us to compost it or, you know, end up composting in their backyards, they feel empowered. Like, there's so much about living in this system that is so disempowering and so belittling in modern society. And being able to get back to those like roots of like how life functions, there's something really comforting about knowing that we belong to that system and knowing how it works and like cooperating with it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And maybe I'm taking this a step too far. So, you just tell me what you think. But Part of me wonders if this aversion to composting or lack of interest stems from our culture's total aversion to death. Now,
Uh,
I know
yeah.
that it seems like a big jump from our food scraps to our own mortality, but I think,
Mm.
you've said it so beautifully, this extreme dissociation that we're facing has to do with the complete distancing of the natural cycle. So I
Mhm.
almost wonder if it is that we have become so far removed from the natural process of life and death that people are no longer even interested in composting because they are that disconnected from the natural order.
Yeah, I do think that on a deeper level, there's a lot of shadow in our society. And I think that, things that we put in shadow are the things that we're really uncomfortable with or that we get afraid of or that are you know, just uncomfortable. Like we just want to pretend that it's not there. And there's a lot in shadow in our communities and society, in modern society. And death is absolutely like top of the list, death, anything that's like just not quote unquote, like this idea of beauty that we have in our minds. It's not youth. It's not safe. It's not, certain. And absolutely, like composting is the death cycle. It's the death, but it's really beautiful because it's the death and it's also the rebirth cycle because once something dies within the cycles of our earth, like it is reborn into something new. But as a society, we have a really hard time with that part of the process and we like to put it in shadow and turn away from it and think about farm to fork because that's such a beautiful, like, farms are so sexy, growing food is so sexy and having it laid out on this plate is so beautiful and appetizing, and then the plate afterwards, like, not really where all that waste goes. It's like society's kind of deemed it as gross, and then they want to end it at that. They don't want to know what happens after the table. But if we don't have, the table to the soil, we don't get the farm food. And then we don't get it back to the table for that beautiful experience for people. We can't have that beautiful experience without the death piece of it too, and that gross part. People might consider it like that gross piece. And it is like definitely a hurdle. And what I do is helping people get past the aversion of like having food scraps in their home and like near where they live instead of just immediately putting it out in the trash outside.
Well, I think that particular phenomenon speaks to this notion of away in our culture, right? We throw things away, but there is no away, you know?
No.
It's removed from sight, but it is still directly impacting us, but we want it squared away neatly. And I think composting does ask you to get a little messy in the most beautiful way.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And people who participate in that process get to see, and that's like part of the beauty that I try and explain to people when I'm like, yes, composting in your backyard is going to provide so much value to your family and to your kids get to see that process and see what comes on the other end when they get to use that like gorgeous, like how does it turn into this incredible smelling material that then grows this nutrient dense plant right in your backyard for you to eat again. It's very magical actually.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that you find compost empowering, act of it, almost an act of rebellion in the system that we live under. We touched on it, but what do you find most empowering about the act of composting?
Think that because the this base empowerment of being able to feed ourselves, and grow food and enjoy that experience of eating that food. It's like the base level of sustenance for our bodies and for our minds and for our spirits. I don't have to depend on the powers that be in any way. It's so not political. It's just very experiential and very simple and very of the earth. And it's very much in my own hands and in whoever's hands that wants to engage in that activity, they can feed themselves. And they can nurture that plant with this like alchemical, beautiful, magical material that comes from just letting this this natural biological process happening with that organic material breaking down. Like just utilizing that, like it's plant food. And you get to have this relationship with kind of what you talked about. It's like this with life and death. It's like this really encapsulated experience of life and death. And it's kind of like getting really close to God or to creation or whatever you want to call it, or just like life in just that really simple process of breaking down organic matter into a fertilizer for your food. It sounds kind of silly and crazy, but there's something about actually getting your hands into that process and creating something like truly magical on the other end, and no one but you and the microbes and that process did it, if that makes sense.
Well, you're building the ground beneath your feet, right? And
Yeah.
it's the only real way that we get to be producers. Even
Mhm.
even with plants, even when we tend them, we're not the ones doing the work. And it
Mhm.
does rely on the microbes with composting, but such a hands-on way to be a part of it. And the more that we talk about compost and its relationship with death and how maybe we shy away from it, this is like a really comical image. And maybe I'm again taking it too far, but it's starting to feel like composting could be for the plant goths, like what taxidermy and like mortuary arts are for just our general goths. And I think that's a fun way too. Do you ever experience that? Do you ever get to be like a plant goth, a green goth, as I call them?
I don't know if I've ever heard that. Like,
I think it's something that lives in my head more than anything else.
okay. I was like, is this like a like social media? Like, I've never heard of this, but I
No, I
mean,
think it's just like something that I imagine because I feel like I'm not punk, but I'm like punk adjacent. So maybe I'm like a green goth, you know?
I definitely do feel like a little bit. I think just being part of this process that is so much in shadow, like, I definitely feel like a little bit of a misfit. Like, kind of like, yeah, a little bit. It's a little bit punk. Like, I feel like less and less so as it becomes like less and less in shadow. But yeah, it's a little bit weird and edgy. And like, if you're looking at it through the lens of, modern society.
And I
Sure.
love that. I love that. Are there any dangers associated with composting? Like, I know that sometimes we talk about there's the whole argument in terms of raising beef and like methane, and I think that's been largely debunked due
Sure.
to the means of farming, industrial versus grass fed and regenerative ag. Are there any dangers associated with compost?
I mean, yeah, I think if it's done, I know if it's done improperly, there's a risk of spreading seeds that you don't want to spread. There's a risk of, spreading things like bad bacteria like E. coli if you're putting it out on like production fields or something. So certainly like we are tending to and monitoring our compost at an industrial scale and making sure that it's reaching temperature and that we are utilizing ingredients that aren't going to be harmful on the other end. Our waste stream in America is so full of toxic and synthetic things. And because the public isn't great at, making sure that the right things end up in the right bins, like we have to do a lot of sorting and making sure that we're getting as much trash out of the food waste that we accept as possible. And also, there's the piece of herbicides, which is super,
Right.
super big for us.
And what about PFAS, our beloved forever chemicals? How big of an obstacle is that for you?
Yeah, polyfluorinated forever chemicals. From my understanding, there's like hundreds of different kinds. They perform different, services in our modern culture of like fire retardants or water repellency, like things that we've really come to know and love and appreciate the function of. We're now finding that those chemicals are highly persistent in um, our bodies and in soil and living things like in the rain. Anywhere you go now, there's PFAS in the rain. And the EPA is now really working to, like, the last several years has been like, this is a huge issue. Like, it's finally coming to the surface that this is happening and that essentially all of our, like, all people have been affected by these chemicals and they cause health issues, like serious health issues. They're connected, especially some of them are really connected to some serious chronic health issues. And that's why biosolids composting is kind of screwed. You want to talk about shadow? Okay, well, human excrement in compost is like really, really shadowy, and no one was into it in the first place. And now that we are pooping out these toxic substances that don't break down, and then we're putting in our soil to grow more food and eat it again, people aren't into that. So, yeah, it's very problematic and it's a huge issue in the world of composting. It shows up, like I said, a lot in the biosolids composting because it's accumulating in our bodies. But we are still needing to monitor it and make sure that our levels are okay because people want to know that the compost and the material that they're putting on their gardens isn't full of forever chemicals.
So you mentioned the whole shadow of composting human excrement. So what does that mean for compost toilets then? Are they beneficial after all? Or are we running into the PFAS in our feces?
I mean, I personally think that uh, I think we need to solve this issue. I think human poop needs to get put back into the growing cycle somehow instead of continue to be pushed into shadow and essentially just pushed into the landfill and encased in the landfill when it, just like food scraps, it's just phosphorus. It's like there's going to be wars fought over phosphorus in the world. There are wars being fought over phosphorus. We need it and we're pooping it out, but we've contaminated it with, our systems that are so full of toxicity. But I am still very much a proponent of using composting toilets. And, most people know what they're taking into their bodies. Are they taking a lot of pharmaceuticals? Okay, well, they might want to look at the product on the other end. That's what I would say is experiment with it. And you can send your end product in to get tested for PFAS and, for other issues that could be showing up in the compost from, persistent residue in your poop.
So total hypothetical here, but as we become more and more desperate to save our soil, do you think that we will begin to trend more towards these less desirable forms of composting, such as composting human waste or even composting human bodies postmortem?
Like, do you think because soil is continuing to be,
As soil
we need to,
continually degrades, do you think we're
yeah.
going to start to favor more advanced forms of composting as a society?
I would like to believe that people would be able to see that this is such a huge issue that they're willing to like call for changes to be happening at the corporate level and at these higher levels of these institutions producing these toxic chemicals that are entering in and like regulatory bodies that are allowing them to enter into our systems and then, render what should be used to build our soils like toxic. So my hope is that people see the importance enough to ask for and call for systems change, which I think is happening. I think a lot of times, though, personally, how I feel about it and how I've seen it is that a lot of times you have to draw a connection to their children's health, to their health. Like, this causes cancer. Like, this can make your child sick in order for people to really speak up and to really be like, no, we need to change this. Like, I don't think saying, like, we need to nurture our soil is enough. Like, we need to make the human health connection piece really clear, or that type of change probably won't happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right. I think not even sometimes, we're a pretty selfish species. you know?
Yeah. Oh,
We
absolutely.
can be motivated by certain cute baby animals, but the soil is probably going to be beyond us until we start to see that we're starving ourselves and we're starving our land.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I would have to agree on that. But what about for people who are interested in getting involved in composting? What is the first step, particularly if they don't have a facility near them?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many resources out on the internet now to help people get started composting. I start with a couple Google searches, like how to do composting specifically where I am. Like, are you in the South? It's going to be a very different environmental context than, Montana, where things freeze. And just, I think I typically tell people to like be realistic about knowing that composting does take time and it does take energy and it takes care. You are facilitating the process, especially if it's food scraps and weed seeds, things that you want to make sure are being processed properly. And you don't want your compost to be like stinky or just not well tended to. Like you're going to need to know that you want to and are committed to setting aside time.
I think another great starting point that maybe you didn't touch on is your own website because you have some really amazing resources listed on your website. And I think it's a wonderful place for people to start their education.
I'm trying to remember what we have on our website.
Yeah, you've got a resources page and it's like some different books that are helpful and some online
Oh,
things.
yeah. Yep.
Well, yeah, check out your website and I'll link that here in the show notes.
Let me also I'm going to look up these books because I'm trying to remember exactly what they're called. One in particular I like a lot that's from a woman in Australia. The Compost Coach is what it's called by Kate Flood. I really like her and I like her approach and how she explains everything. Some of it is a little bit confusing because she's in Australia and, they're on the metric system, which is like, makes sense, but it's not what it's not what we're used to. So that could be annoying for people. But besides that, I think she just has a great way of explaining composting.
That's a wonderful one we can check out. And I will be sure to link that in the show notes as
Cool.
well. And we'll end on this question. I always love to ask my guest, what about this process, composting, makes you feel most rooted? Rooted being what makes you feel most connected to your values, connected to what's important to you, just grounded in a world that is designed for us to feel like we're spiraling.
What about it makes me feel most grounded? I think it's actually physically being involved and like present for and involved in the process of doing it, like the physicality of it and feeling and like actually getting to see and smell these food scraps. And, at this larger scale, we're using loaders, we're using tractors. But in my backyard, like putting it into a pile and tending to it with my body, with my mind, with my senses, and then, watching a natural biological process take place over time, and then getting to feel with my hands on the other end and smell with my senses on the other end. This biochemical process that's taken place that has sustained life on earth for millions of years and getting to be part of that and feel it and sense it with my whole being, you know? Yeah.
I know just what you mean, and I can smell the compost even as you're talking about it. Not in its mid stages, maybe at the end when lovely and finished.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Alyssa, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for your time. I will be sure to link your social media and your website in the show notes here so that our listeners can stay engaged with your business and follow along as I know it's going to continue to progress.